Well, here we are, back again. As you can see, my good friend from France, Odon Lafontaine. We've been friends for a few weeks now, and Odon's going to do something a little bit different than what he did before. Most of you know that we no longer trust the 9th and 10th century traditions. We've thrown them away. The Standard Islamic Narrative, we're not going to anymore. And we're moving back over here to the 7th century when it supposedly all happened. If it happened here, then we should be able to see it. We should be able to look at it. We should be able to find all kinds of artifacts and an enormous amount of material that exposes and gives us names, dates, places of the events that the traditions talk about, but we just can't. Now, what we have been doing in this team with Murad and with Mel and with Joe and with Paul is to look at all the artifacts back here and try to piece together what did exist. Trying to piece it together so we can make sense of it. We wish the Muslims would have done that, but they didn't. So we're going to now come to a smoking Odon over here as he's puffing on his pipe. And we've asked him to look at another category, a whole new category. In fact, he is going to look at this book here. He's going to use this book to help understand what really happened, but also to show that the Standard Islamic Narrative has been imposing on this book. Now, which one do you have there that you're holding up?
It's Droge.
Okay, you like the Droge's one?
Very good translation.
That's the one you should use. This is the one Muslims demand you use. You notice this is the small one, the little one. I always keep this one smaller than my Bible because it's absolutely hopeless. It's the worst translation. This is the Hilali and Khan translation. But because when I engage with Muslims, this is the only one they'll let me use. That's why I hold it up. And you can see it's getting smaller and smaller as we go along. Take a look at all these here. You can see why. You notice I'm wearing my brown shirt. When I heard that Odon was going to be using the Qur'an to help understand what really happened and also to show how hopeless the traditions are, because the traditions were created to unpack the Qur'an. But what they didn't know and what they didn't realize is you've got to unpack what happened in the 7th century, because even the Qur'an, if it is from the 7th century, and Odon and I do not agree on that, if it is from the 7th century, then it should give us an awful lot of areas that we can look at. So that's what he's going to do. And that's what, Odon, you've been working on this for years, haven't you?
Yes, but I'm merely the speaker of scholars who worked tens of years on the subject.
Oh, that's all of us. We're all that. None of us have done this germinal research ourselves. We are their mouthpiece. We are the ones
exactly the mouthpiece.
We're taking
especially
what they're saying.
I speak for Edouard Marie Galès, who made a tremendous thesis. He published it in 2005, and he really made a groundbreaking discovery using the Quran as source material, because a big part of the Quran actually comes from the 7th century. Of course, it has been edited, it has been a bit changed, corrected, but some of it undoubtedly dates from the 7th century.
Oh, don't stop there. It goes back to the 4th century. We have parts of the Quran.
And even before.
I mean, we even have parts of the Quran that go back to 1400 BC. So because so much of it is borrowed from many different sources, you will find. And so when he's saying the Quran comes from the 7th century, he's not necessarily talking about this book in 114 surahs as we see it here. So just so people don't get upset and say, wait, how can he say that? How can he prove that? I'm just going to obviate that problem. He's not saying that. What he is saying is the material in the Quran, but much of the poetry come from Christian lectionaries and also Christian hymns. They were put together in the 5th, 6th century. Some of it even goes back to the 4th century. So that we understand. But you're also saying that you believe that somebody put this book together at also in the 7th century.
The process started in the 7th century.
Okay.
We don't really know when it ended. Maybe it ended in 1924 with the Cairo edition. But the process...
that was the Qira'at. That's a different discussion. But as far as the manuscripts are concerned, I think most scholars, and I would agree with them, would say around the 10th century. It could even be as early as the.
You see, one thing is the manuscript, and another thing is the meaning.
Okay. Well, that's a whole.
Nowadays, Muslims still keep on inventing new meanings.
But let's go back and let's give it to you. I'm going to give you now. Help us here. Use the Quran to unpack and help us understand what was really happening, because the Quran is a window to that, is it not?
I think so. It is a great help with Mel, with Joe, with Paul, and with all the scholars. We have seen a lot of new material. And I think with the Quran, we can make all of this fit in a scheme, a pattern.
Okay.
A grand pattern that will explain us what happened during the 7th century. And you will see that all the pieces will fit together.
Okay.
So now we might have our differences with Mel, Joe, Murad, and other scholars also, but the key point here is to look at the pattern, and this is what I will try to present now.
Okay, over to you. And we're going to just do a quick overview at this point. We will unpack more of it, bits and pieces of it, as we go on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. So at first, I wanted to just have a very, very quick look at the standard Islamic narrative, because it has always been, for most people who took an interest in Islamic origin, a sort of starting point. The standard Islamic narrative is all about a prophet who revealed the Quran to ignorant pagans. Thus, a whole new religion developed, a religion pretending to be the sort of return to a primordial religion, which return corrected the Jewish and Christian deviances of this primordial religion. And then it paved the way for the Arab conquest and the rise of the Caliphal Empire. This is more or less the standard Islamic narrative. But we will see that this standard Islamic narrative and the Islamic reading of the Quran are being seriously challenged nowadays by the new studies. But at first, there is the obvious, which needs to be stated. The standard Islamic narrative has imposed a sort of preconceived idea about Islam, about its origin, and especially that imposed an Islamic reading of the Quran. Without even knowing it, we are kind of forced into an interpretation which abides by the standard Islamic narrative, with concepts such as a unique prophet who uttered God's word, or pretended to utter God's word, which was formed into a book. God's words was a book. The revelation was a book. This book, of course, is the Quran, which is mentioned in the Quranic text. It happened in the Hijaz area in Arabia. It was a pagan environment. The Arabs were pagans, polytheists at this time. It happened at the beginning of the 7th century, around Mecca and Medina. There was an ancient shrine, Abrahamic shrine in Mecca, and also an ancient pilgrimage. Those are the concepts by which we think Islam, and we think Islam's origin. But in order to think Islam, really, we have to start from scratch. This is what the revisionist school of the 70s, John Wansbrough, Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, made clear. We have to start from scratch. We have to start by looking at the sources, at what we know really existed at the time of the origins, and not relying on narrative that were written during the 9th, 10th, 11th century, and even after. So as we keep on stating the obvious about Islamic narrative, And this is why we have to start from scratch. We see that the standard Islamic narrative does not make sense in many ways. There are many contradictions, many discrepancies, many things that are very odd in terms of logic, simple logic, history, geography. I've put some here. Of course, it's only a selection, but one could ask, why is there no mention, or no mention at all, or maybe one or two, but quasi no mention of the key role of the Arabs in the major events of the 7th century? You see, Jay, you know that in the 7th century, the Arabs were not only in Arabia, they were kind of everywhere in the Middle East. Here is a map which I have taken from Dan Gibson's Quranic Geography. Those are the main trade routes of the Nabatean Arabs. And we see that before the 7th centuries, those routes were everywhere in the Middle East, along the main Silk Road, and the Arabs, the nomadic Arabs, dwelled on those routes. So they were in Damascus, they were in Palmyra, they were in Babylon, they were in Yemen, of course, they were in Petra, they were in Palestine, they were in Egypt. There were Arabs everywhere. There were nomadic Arabs, and there were also settled, sedentary Arabs. Or the Arabs were not all Bedouins, of course. There were Arabs living in the city, and the Arabs at this time, during the 7th century, they were at the very center of the struggling between the two main superpowers of the time, the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. We see that the dwellings of the Arabs, they were exactly on the frontier between the empires, and the empires played the Arabs. Every empire playing his allies, his Arab auxiliaries against its opponents. For example, in Yemen, here in the 5th century, there was a Christian kingdom allied to Aksum, Ethiopia, and the Persian, they helped the Yemenites, the Arab Yemenites, to push back this Christian kingdom and establish a Jewish kingdom. It was a move against Byzantium, because Byzantium was allied with Ethiopia. And so Persia played the Arabs against Byzantium. Whereas in Byzantium, had its allies, the Ghassanid tribes in the east of east of Syria, for example. And they were kind of in between the empires. And it has been like this in centuries, tens of centuries. The Romans had their Arab auxiliaries against the Sassanids, against the Persians. And it kept on going like this for centuries and centuries. At the beginning of the 7th centuries, the war between Byzantium and Persia came back. And once again, the Arabs were implicated, waging war for Byzantium, for Persia, against one another, because they were at the center, at the epicenter of the game of influence, the game of war between the two main superpowers. So it's very strange that in the standard Islamic narrative, we have no indication, no mention of the key role of the Arabs during those events. Another thing which is very, very strange, it is that we have now found, thanks to people like Julien Christian Robin and many other archaeologists, we have now found that there is absolutely no trace of any active Arab paganism in the 7th century. Active active cults. There might have been relics and old stuff, but there was no active cult at this time because the Arabs were mostly Christianized at the time. We will see this. Another thing is that the Mecca, the actual, the current Mecca, does not fit the standard Islamic description. This has been pointed out by Patricia Krohn, who pointed the obvious that Mecca is in the current Mecca is in a desert, and nothing grows in Mecca. But the standard Islamic narrative places certain events that we find in the Quran in the Meccan site. And so we are supposed to believe that the Quran describes the Meccans as being farmers who cultivate pomegranates, vines, wheat, olive trees, date palms, and they have camels, goats, and there are also fishermen. They fish and shells in salt water and also in freshwater seas. And there are no freshwater seas in the Middle East apart from Syria and current Israel. So there is something very, very odd here. The standard Islamic narrative does not fit the current Meccan site. Also,
can I just jump in real quickly? And you will get a kickback, and so Muslims have done this with me, and I'm sure you've had it as well. Those who are listening, Muslims will say, well, look at Saudi Arabia today. It has olive trees. What are you saying? What do you mean it doesn't have any olive trees? And you look at Mecca today, it has buildings. There's all kinds of enormous, you showed the clock tower, the fourth highest building in the world. So what do you mean that there is no civilization there? There are no big cities there. In the 21st century, yes, because of oil wealth, because of Saudi Arabian oil wealth. It has created all of this in our lifetime, in yours and my, Odon. And this is what most people don't realize. Don't look at modern Saudi Arabia and yes, you have olive trees in modern Saudi Arabia, but in the 7th century, this was just nothing more than a hamlet. There weren't very many people living here at all. This was known as...
This could not have been a big city. It's not possible. Everything has to be brought from the outside. The food for the animals.
There's no vegetation. If there's no vegetation, there are no people. And that's why this viewpoint that because they're there today, they must have been there way back in the 7th century. Absolutely not. There was nothing there.
What has changed? What has changed? It is the wealth of the Arabs. One needs an empire, a very big state to provide for Mecca.
Yeah.
Without the state, and there was no such state, no such empire in the 7th century, no city could have survived in the Meccan desert.
Yeah. And would not survive today without everything being brought in. It all has to be brought in. It's an artificial city.
Exactly. Also, on your channel, Jay, you had Mel, Paul, Joe, talking about Jerusalem and Mecca.
Yeah.
And the thing about the Quran describing Jerusalem and not Mecca. One thing that is very, very strange in the standard Islamic narrative is the issue of the place of Abraham, Maqam Ibrahim, the place where Abraham stood. He stood before God as if in judgment, because in a sense, there are two places of Abraham in the standard Islamic narrative. There is, of course, the traditional Meccan place of Abraham, but also the standard Islamic narrative kind of gives credit to Jerusalem being a legit place of Abraham. Because in Jerusalem, according to the standard Islamic narrative, there is the Temple of Jerusalem. We find in the Quran that Zachariah visited Maryam in the sanctuary, Mihrab, which designates the Temple of Jerusalem. we also know that thanks to the Quran that Moses led the people to Jerusalem, in fact, to the place of Abraham. And so why did those Islamic prophets, such as Moses, such as Zechariah, and also Jesus, who was teaching in the temple, why were there in Jerusalem if Jerusalem was not the place of Abraham? Why did Moses take the people into Canaan, into Israel, into Jerusalem, and not into Mecca at this time? You see here, there is something that doesn't work in the standard Islamic narrative. And this needs to be pointed out. Also, we see in the standard Islamic narrative that the Christians are called Nazarenes, Nasara, and they are not called by their real name, Masihun. Masih, is the real name that the Arab Christian used for themselves way before Islam. And we know this because the Christianization of the Arabs has been very well documented. It started at the first centuries, even the first century. We can see in the Act of the Apostles that Arabs were there at the Pentecost. In the Christian tradition tells us about the apostles Matthias and Shimon, who respectively evangelized Jordan and Arabia. We found many Christian inscriptions in Arabia, thanks to archaeologists such as Julien Christian Robin. Here's a photo of an inscription, Christian inscription in Hima, north of Najran, from the 5th century, a Christian inscription. And we have many sources telling us how the Arabs were Christianized, for example, by Saint Euthymius the Great in the 5th century, who baptized an Arab leader, Peter Asbebetos, and this Arab leader became a bishop, the bishop of the Arabs, and he was at the Council of Ephesus in the 5th century. So this is well documented. And even more, we know that at the end of the 6th century, the king, the Persian, made a sort of king of all Arabs. His name was Al-Numan III, Ibn al-Mundir. He was, according to the Chronicle of Seth, the king of all the Arabs of the empires of Persia and Byzantium, and he was baptized. Hence, we understand that every Arab under his rule was baptized too. This was the way, those were the customs of these times. And so the
Odon, everything you're pointing out here, you're talking about Himma, Najran, that's in Yemen, that's in the south. You're talking about the Lakhmids, you're talking about the Sassanids, that's way in the north. You're not talking about anything in the middle part. Have you noticed that? All these Arabs, go back to that map, and you'll see these Arabs are all way up in the north where the Sassanids and Lakhmids, see where they are? That is where Jordan is. The Lakhmids is where Iraq is. And then Himyar is way down in Yemen. What about the Hijaz?
Yemen, okay. And in the middle, we have kind of the big nowhere, the Hijaz, where there is no sign of Christian activity, but there is no sign of pagan activity.
Or
there is no sign of activity.
There is no sign of anything down there. There are no civilizations in the middle part. Interestingly, all the
in the western middle part, because in Kinda we find traces of ancient Christianism.
But Odon, where in Kinda? Where?
I've got a book here.
It's on the Persian Gulf. It's on the coastal areas.
Yes, of course, but hey, what do you want? What do you want?
This is why people
nothing lives in the desert.
But can you see, you've got to make this point really, really clear, because today, Riyadh is right in the middle of Kinda. Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia, and people think Riyadh is there. That's where the Arabs lived, and they would say also that Jeddah is right next to Mecca, and Jeddah is a huge city. And they're saying, therefore, there were people living here. This is why the Standard Islamic Narrative is correct. But what's interesting is everything you've just pointed to in the last 10 minutes is either way up in the north or way down in the south, but nothing in between. Even when you talked about Kinda, that's off near the coast, the eastern coast. It's not inland, and it's nowhere near Mecca or Medina.
Good point. Let me go back. So there is something very strange, nonetheless. The Quran does not talk about Christians as Masihi, which is their real name. There is only one occurrence of the Christians being named people of the gospel. Otherwise, they are called Nasara. But Nasara, Nazarene, is not the name of Christians. It used to be the name of the first Judeo-Christians in the first centuries, but the Christian kind of ditched this name, and they named themselves Mashiun in Aramaic, people of the Messiah, and Masihi, which is exactly the same in Arabic, people of Al-Masih, of Jesus. Another very strange thing about those Nazarenes, they are supposed to be Christian according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, but in the Quran, they are described as being the allies of the Jews in the 7th century, which could not have been possible. In the 7th centuries, Christians and Jews were arch enemies. There were some tragic events and uprising of the Jews in the Byzantine Empire, the taking of Jerusalem by an alliance of Persian and Jews, also with the help of some Arabs. And the Jews took over Jerusalem, they assumed power there, and there were many persecutions against the Christian. And beforehand, the Jews were expelled by the Romans in the 2nd century from the land, and they were not allowed to come back to Jerusalem. So there was a strong enmity between Jews and Christians, and they could definitely not be called allies in the 7th century. So something also here is very wrong in the Standard Islamic Narrative. Another contradiction in the Quran, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, also about the Nazarenes, is that they are described as being the closest to the believers and also as being the enemies of the believers. And this is very strange. And you see that in most translation of the Quran, the translator kind of hides this contradiction. It's a contradiction between the verse in Surah 5, 51 and 82. We will look at them in detail thereafter. And lastly, as the last of the contradiction I want to point out here is it is what you hinted at. There is no trace of Christianity in the Hijaz, but in the Standard Islamic Narrative, Muhammad's wife, Khadija, is supposed to be a Nazarene or a mixed Nazarene, half Arab, we don't really know. But her cousin, Waraka bin Nawfal, is a Nazarene. He's supposed to be a Christian living in a place where there is absolutely no trace of Christianity. And is also being described as a former Jew who converted to Christianism. So it is very strange. The thing also, and we will look at it in detail thereafter, if Khadija's cousin was a Nazarene, and if Khadija was a Nazarene herself, doesn't it mean that all the in-laws of Muhammad were Nazarenes? Jewish, former Jewish? You see, we start to uncover something. And this is what I want to see here. New discoveries that tells us about the particular influence of a group being described as a Jewish group at the origins of Islam. You see, I've told you already about the taking of Jerusalem in 614 by an alliance of Persian and Babylonian Jews. And they did it so with the help of Arab allies and auxiliaries and there was an attempt to rebuild the temple at this time. This is the first clue. There are also sources, very early sources from the 7th century. A source, for example, that tells us that a prophet appeared with the Saracen. This source, you know it, Jay, it's Doctrina Jacobi.
Yeah.
It's a propaganda document. It's not, it was not written by an historian, but we can make something of it. It's a propaganda document criticizing the Jews, and it features a dialogue between two Jews, and they are asking themselves about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracen. What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracen? So for those Jews, he's a false prophet, but this is not the issue here. The issue is that we have two Jewish people asking about a prophet. They are not asking about a Muslim prophet, a prophet of Islam. Of course, they're asking about a Jewish prophet. Mm-hmm. So a man of Jewish extraction, or at least half Jewish, or something must have some Jewish blood to pretend to be a Jewish prophet. And also, what prophet? What is the prophet that the Jews are waiting for? They are waiting for the prophet that will be the precursor of the Messiah. The prophet that will tell them the Messiah is about to come, which for us Christians is John the Baptist. Right. So also other sources that tells us that the Jews called the Arabs to their head. This is in the Pseudo-Sibios, an anonymous text from the 7th century, who tells us about the story of Jews who were expelled from Edessa, and the Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship they had through the books of the Old Testament. And here we have the mention of MHMD, Muhammad, in that period, a certain one of them, Arabs then. So you see in the Doctrina Jacobi, he was a potential candidate for the Jewish prophecy, so he must have had some Jewish blood. Here he is described as being an Arab, a man of the son of Ishmael, named Muhammad, a merchant. So this is a very, very well-known nowadays source about Muhammad. What's interesting here is that Muhammad teaches the Arab into a kind of Jewish faith. He teaches them a sort of Abrahamic ascendance, and he said to them that God promised that country to Abraham. Obviously, it's not Mecca here. It's Canaan, it's Israel. God promised that country to Abraham and to his son after him, so Ishmael. Now, however, you are the son of Abraham through Ishmael, and so God shall fulfill the promise made to Abraham and his son on you, the Arabs, the Christian Arabs. Only love the God of Abraham, which means don't love Jesus as God, so don't associate, and go and take the country which God gave to your father Abraham. Which country? Mecca, the Hijaz, or Palestine, or Israel, Canaan. So there again, something to link the origins of Islam to a kind of Jewishness. But is it really Judaism? We will see. Thereafter, we know that Jerusalem was taken by the Arab around 638, and they were guided by Jews. We have another source from 670, and an anonymous text in the Pratum Spirituale of John Moscus, which said that when the Arabs came to Jerusalem, so when they took Jerusalem around 638, there were with them men from among the sons of Israel who showed them the location of the temple. Another strange thing, when we see that the Jews were forbidden to enter Jerusalem under Christian rule, they shortly came back to Jerusalem between 614 and 617. But thereafter, they were kind of expelled again, especially when the Christian took Jerusalem back. But around 638, when the Arab took Jerusalem, Jews came back to Jerusalem with them. But they were expelled by the Arabs 2 years later. We see this in the Jewish traditions, the history of Palestine by Moshe Gil. Also something very strange. The Jews were friends with the Arabs at the time. They came with them to Jerusalem, and then those very same Arabs expelled them from Jerusalem. You see something of a coincidence with the Nazarenes we spoke about as being both friends and enemies of the believers. We will look at it thereafter. We see also that Jerusalem played a crucial role, I forgot the word, role, in the Islamic eschatology. Mel already told you about this. He took it from me. He took it from Professor Guillaume D, French scholar, very, very proficient scholar, and who was a leading scholar in Quranic studies, and who discovered that in some of the Islamic tradition, Jerusalem is supposed to be the place of the Judgment Day, the place of gathering. There will be a gathering here in Jerusalem of the nation. Gathering and resurrection of the dead will take place in Jerusalem. And also there is something about the rock which is the summit of the Temple Mount, which is now under the dome of the rock. This rock is supposed to be, in this tradition, the navel of the world. Navel as being surah in Arabic, which is the part that remains after the umbilical cord, sur, has been cut. So we see that this exact location, this rock, was supposed to be the link, the connection between the paradise, heaven, and earth. And this is the ultimate place. This is where the apocalypse is supposed to happen. We also saw in the previous presentation with Mel and with Paul that the valley of the Kidron between Mount Moriah and Mount Scopus was the place which was described by Prophet Joel as the place of the gathering of the nations for the judgment, the place, the valley of decision. I've quoted Joel here. Yes, in those days, in that time, and I restored Judah and Jerusalem from captivity. I will gather all the nation, bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of decision, the valley of Kidron. There I will enter in judgment against them concerning my people, my inheritance, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations as they divided up my land. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decisions. So there is something very eschatological, apocalyptical in Jerusalem, and the early Muslims were believing it also. Also, we see in the Standard Islamic Narrative some very strange characters, such as Kab al-Ahbar, which is described as being a former Jew who converted to Islam, maybe like Waraka bin Naufal, we don't know. He's not named a Nazarene, but a former Jew who converted to Islam. But even though he was a true Muslim, he wanted to build a synagogue on the Temple Mount, which is very odd for a Muslim. A Muslim is supposed to build a mosque, not a synagogue. And also a Jew does not build anything else at the temple, on the Temple Mount. why would he want to build a synagogue? Was he a rabbinical Jew or was he a Muslim? Again, something very odd here. And at last, I wanted to point out what I will develop now is some new Quranic studies about the biblical context and the Aramaic background of the Quran, first thing. But second thing, and the most important, what we will see now, it is the new global exegesis that has been developed by Edouard Marie-Gallet and many others before him, Antoine Moussali, Youssef Dora Haddad, other Eastern Christians. And this global exegesis, you know already a bit about it, Jay, because when you did the work about Mecca and Jerusalem, this was all about a global exegesis, which means looking at a particular expression, for example, Masjid al-Haram, looking at it in the Quranic text, looking at every occurrence, trying to make sense of those occurrences, comparing the senses between them. And in doing so, we get the literal sense of the expression. So we did it for Masjid al-Haram. We did it with the forbidden place of worship, which is supposed to be the Haram in Mecca, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative. But we know now that it is the Temple Mount, the forbidden place of worship, because Jerusalem was forbidden to Jewish people at this time, and the Hajj could not be performed there. And you've seen this also for example, for the Beit, the house, the temple, which also pertains to Jerusalem and not to Mecca. And so we saw here that the Standard Islamic Narrative, the Islamic reading of the Quran, is being very seriously challenged by new discoveries, by obvious things, logical things, just like we saw. And especially, in particular, we see that those new discoveries tend to point at the influence of a Jewish group or people being described as Jewish. And those people might have had a very decisive influence at the beginnings of Islam. But what we have here now is only mostly external sources, Doctrina Jacobi and so on, a critical approach of the Standard Islamic Narrative, but in itself, it's not enough to know what is this Jewish group. We have to go into the Quran, we have to take a deep dive into the Quran and to look into the people of the book. Who are the people of the book? We will see that there are good people of the book, bad people of the book. There are coverers, kuffars among the people of the book. The Nazarenes are part of the people of the book, and they were very close to the believers. And so we will see this, I guess, in another presentation.
Well, listen, thanks so much. This has been good for you to give a quick overview leading up. This will be the first episode. We're going to move into another episode where you're actually going to start unpacking the Quran, which will be a good introduction to that huge corpus of material. Now, what's interesting is we've had Joe give his viewpoint from a Jewish standpoint. We've had Mel give his viewpoint from a historical standpoint. You're coming in from a French standpoint, and you're using French scholars, Edouard Marie-Gallet. We've never heard of this guy before. And what you're doing, in some ways, devoid of each other, we're coming to the same conclusions. Have you noticed this? You down in France and we up in Britain and also here in the United States, we're all going back to the same artifacts, the same material. And we're finding that there is a problem. There's a problem with the standard Islamic narrative from the 9th century, because they're assuming that all these characters and all these people and all these events are happening in the middle part of Arabia. You showed the maps there. That cannot be. They either happened down in the Himyar area, what is today Yemen, or they happened in Jerusalem. And so much of what the standard Islamic narrative took away from Jerusalem and tried to replace it, transport it, and transfer it down to Mecca and Medina are now coming to naught. That's why it's so good to have your viewpoint and our viewpoint coinciding together to show the standard Islamic narrative is full of holes. One more, big holes. And so that's why it's so good now. And then we're going to move into the Quran. Keep your pipe going. Keep it nice and hot because we're going to come right back. It's good to have you here, Odon. And it's good to now
Thank you, Jay.
Let's open up the Quran and let's see what we can find. This is Jay here in the United States and Odon there in France. Over and out.